In class, we left off talking about asexual reproduction and the incredible regeneration ability of flatworms. But they also have sexual reproduction. Most of these species are hermaphroditic. They have copulation and internal fertilization. In other groups with hermaphroditic mating systems, like the gastropods, we talked about how this can work in several different ways. In some species, both individuals might exchange sperm and then each produces eggs. In others, one individual acts as the male and one as the female. And sometimes they're male for part of their life and female at other points in their life or development. There's a lot of variation in how this works in Platyhelminthes. But in some species, the two worms compete to see who will act as the male, donating sperm, and who has to provide the extra resources needed to produce and lay eggs. We'll see an example of that in a minute. But regardless of the mating system, worms receiving sperm usually store it in a seminal receptacle until they're ready to fertilize eggs. So we mentioned that these battles can take place to see who will donate the sperm and who will have to produce eggs. Again, producing eggs takes a lot more resources, so it's in the worm's best interest to avoid that if they can. In some species, this battle can get pretty epic, and mating happens by something called traumatic insemination. Basically, one worm stabs the other with its penis, injects sperm anywhere into the body, and then that sperm travels through the body tissues to the gonads to fertilize the eggs. So open up the lecture slides if you haven't already, so you can click the link and watch this video of this mating behavior. After mating, again, fertilization takes place internally in whichever worm received sperm, and then fertilized eggs are laid. There's a lot of variation here in their development depending on the species. Some will have larval forms, especially in the parasitic species. So you'll see some examples of that in a minute. But in most, we just have direct development. So small worms that look very much like adults hatch from eggs and then grow into adults. There's three groups of flatworms we're going to talk about. First are the free-living flatworms, the Turbellaria. Then we'll talk about two parasitic groups, the trematodes and the cestoda, or the tapeworms. As a side note, these are probably not monophyletic groups, but we don't quite have enough genetic information to understand the evolutionary relationships between different species in Platyhelminthes. So we generally break them down into these three classes, but they're really more based on morphology and life history than anything else. So this classification will probably change as we uncover more information. Turbellaria, again, are the free-living flatworms. Most of them are small, less than an inch long, but there's some species that can grow up to 2 feet long. You can find them in a wide range of habitats. Aquatic species can be either marine or in freshwater, and there's also lots of terrestrial species. Most of them are predators, but there's also species who are scavengers. They can have several different forms of locomotion. A lot of aquatic species have many cilia on the ventral or bottom surface of their body that they use to glide along surfaces. But some species can swim. This looks a lot like the nudibranchs or the sea slugs we talked about in gastropoda. They have extensions of their body that act as fins. Check out this video to see what that looks like. Some of the marine species especially can be really colorful and beautiful, again a lot like those nudibranchs, but they're in a completely separate phylum. Terrestrial species usually move by muscle contractions, very similar to the terrestrial snails and slugs. The terrestrial species need to live in moist environments and are most active at night when it's cooler and wetter, so they aren't as likely to dry out. Again, with no circulatory or respiratory system, they rely on diffusion to breathe. And just like in our lungs, that diffusion is usually happening in some kind of fluid, so they need moisture to do that efficiently. This worm here is a hammerhead worm, which is one of the common terrestrial groups. I mentioned that most of these guys are predators and some are scavengers. The predators usually eat small prey because, again, they're usually pretty small animals. This video shows a turbolarian eating protist, so you can pause and take a look at that. But some species can eat slightly larger prey by having something called an eversible pharynx. Their pharynx comes out of their body, basically turning inside out. It can then either swallow the prey whole or start the digestive process outside the body by injecting or coating the prey in digestive juices. If you want to see what this looks like, check out this video of a hammerhead worm eating a snail. Now let's move on to the class Trematoda, many of which are also referred to as flukes. These are internal parasites, many of which can infect humans. They feed on cells or body fluids inside their host, attaching themselves to the tissue with suckers. While we mentioned that most Platyhelminthes have simple life cycles with direct development, these guys are the exception to that. They often have complex life cycles with several different larval stages. Each of these stages may develop in a different host. This is a pretty diverse group. There's about 11,000 species, so about half of all flatworms are trematodes. Not all of these can infect humans, but there's several that can, and we'll talk about two examples. In both of the examples we talk about, you'll notice that during the life cycle, the initial host of the parasite is a gastropod. Then they complete another part of their life cycle in a second host, which is usually some kind of terrestrial vertebrate. So our first example is schistosomiasis, which we already talked about when we talked about gastropods. But that time we were focused on the snails as a host for the parasite and not the parasite itself. So you can go back to the gastropod lecture to remind yourself of the symptoms and where schistosomiasis is found. Again, you don't need to memorize all the details and larval types of the life cycle here. But what I want you to notice is that we have several different life stages and two different hosts. The first larval stage infects an aquatic snail. Then a new free-living larval stage emerges from the snail and burrows into a human host, where it changes form again, migrates around the body and the blood, and finally reaches its adult stage. This is why parasites are so interesting. Just imagine how complicated it is to evolve such a complex life cycle with many different body forms and larval types, each adapted to a different environment, either an external environment, in a snail, in a human, and then in different body systems in that human or other vertebrate. So here's our new example of a disease caused by infection with a fluke or trematode. Chinese liver fluke disease. A little bit less complex here, but you can see that we still have an aquatic snail as an intermediate host, then a free-swimming larva that infects a vertebrate host in which the adults will form. In this case, that terminal host is a fish. Humans aren't the target host, but they can become infected when they eat infected fish. Once inside the human body, the fluke, which again entered through the digestive system when that person ate infected fish, embeds itself in the bile ducts. If it's not treated, this can cause liver disease and ultimately organ damage. We don't have to worry about Chinese liver fluke disease here in the US, but it's found throughout much of Asia, so something to be wary of if you're traveling in that part of the world. Fortunately, the parasites are pretty easily killed with anti-helminthics, dewormers that specifically target Platyhelminthes. But again, if it's not caught early and treated quickly, that infection can cause organ damage, particularly to the liver. And our final group is the class Cestoda, the tapeworms. These are also internal parasites, but they usually live in the digestive system, and have simpler life cycles than the trematodes. They also are usually less harmful to their hosts. If you have mammalian pets like cats or dogs, these are some of the common worms your pet might get that you would treat with anti-helminthics. One thing that sets them apart from the other Platyhelminthes is that they do have a segmented body, and you'll see that's important for the way they reproduce. Tapeworms grow in a way that's kind of similar to the annelids. Again, their body is made up of many segments, which are called proglottids. They grow by producing new proglottids in the area just behind their head. And this process is called strobilation, just like the process we saw in the polyp form of cnidarians. This is considered a form of asexual reproduction, because each of these proglottids develops its own reproductive organs. And then once it's mature, it breaks off from the worm's body. They then pass through and out of the digestive system so they can infect a new host. So here's what a tapeworm life cycle looks like. Again, the adult worm inside a host produces and pops off those proglottids through asexual reproduction. Those are passed in the waste. So this is one of the things your vet might look for in a stool sample for your pet. A new host then gets infected by eating food contaminated with proglottids. So your dog might get it from literally eating poop or anything else on the ground that's contaminated with waste. Herbivores might pick it up while grazing somewhere that an infected animal has defecated. Depending on the parasite you're talking about, there may be several different hosts, but those hosts are always vertebrates. Once ingested, the proglottids develop into adult worms and start producing their own proglottids in the intestines. So they settle there in the intestines, attach themselves to the internal surface, and then basically leach nutrients as digestive food passes through. Usually this doesn't cause a lot of damage. Again, they aren't feeding on the host's tissues. They're just taking some of their nutrients. If the parasite load gets very high, it can start to be problematic, but most of the time the host is just losing some of the food they're eating to the tapeworms. Because of this, tapeworms actually used to be marketed and sold as a dieting strategy for humans. Basically, you would take a pill containing tapeworm proglottids, infect yourself with tapeworms, and then those tapeworms would consume some of the food you were eating. Then after a while, you'd take a second pill that was an anti-helminthic to kill off the tapeworms. Okay, so that's it for Platyhelminthes. Good luck studying for Monday's exam, and I'll see you guys then.